There are a few things in Premiere Pro that we realized just crash. For example, like literally today, we realized there's one thing, tried it 3 times, every single time, exactly the same place, it crashes. Please! But at the same time, it's Premiere Pro's fault as well. Sometimes even in a random place where you're not doing anything, it's just like at their idle and then zoom. So if you're asking me, has your PC crashed since upgrading to it? And I say, yes, it has. I've had a few blue screens of death, but I also figured out why this was happening. And this is what actually is helpful about this video. So then, this is the dream editing PC, and I have been using it for 2-3 months now. We've made a couple of dozen videos on it, edited like 10-20 terabytes of footage on it, pushed it to like the limits in a kind of a long period of time. And I'm not sure if you remember, I swapped from Ryzen to the Intel 13900K, and it was quite balls to the wall, but believe it or not, I found some bottlenecks and I upgraded this even more. So now it's time to talk about to see how did that hold up, and if it was worth it, and what are some of the downside, upside, because I found some things that I was super impressed with, and some of the things that I was like, oh pants, that didn't work. So let's talk about those so you can make the right choice when building one of these.
Looking for a cheap way to license your Windows? Check out Whokeys through the links in the video description. Make sure to use the code TN20 to get a 30% off. Paste the license to the activation settings and you're all done. This license is for Windows 10, but you can upgrade it to Windows 11 for free. They also offer Microsoft Office 19 license. Use the same code TN20 to get a 30% off. Check out whokeys.com in the video description below.
So let's start with the final upgrades and some of the specifications. As you already see in there, you can see 4 sticks of RAM, not 2 sticks of RAM. So I doubled the RAM capacity from 64 to 128 gigabytes because I realized I am bottlenecked by RAM. We are editing and exporting all the time at the same time, and often even loading some of these big projects, what it does is like loads rows of stuff on the RAM and then kind of offloads it from RAM. But we were waiting so long for these projects to open and things. I was like, we've got one of the fastest, we've got like literally the fastest PC on planet what can do editing in our workflow, and we're still waiting. What the heck is the problem? Then I realized I am like using 63 or something like that gigabytes of RAM out of 64. Then I realized, ooh, I think that RAM is the bottleneck. I bought the same kit of RAM and then added it there. And then I realized that sometimes I'm using like 86 or 90 gigabytes of RAM in our workflow. So that's gone a little bit better. But there's a little bit of a downside with that as well, which we'll talk in a moment. Also, I upgraded the storage in there. I previously had 2 plus 2 terabytes of like NVMe there, and these were our project drives. So 1 terabyte for OS, and then 2 plus 2 for the projects, and then 500 gigs for the cache drive. But now I upgraded the project drives from 2 terabytes to 4 terabytes because the Western Digital SN850X 4 terabyte drives were on a massive deal a little while ago, and I was like, okay, let's do it. Plus the UK government were having a special thing around March or something like that, where you can basically put business expenses into your business as 130%. And because this PC qualified there, I get a massive discount as a business. You know, you get the VAT off plus 130% business expense, which means that eventually it will be much, much cheaper, especially if you find things on a deal as well. It's going to be much cheaper than just a normal person paying, you know, retail for it. So now I have 4 plus 4 terabytes of NVMe projects and 2 terabytes of cache drive. That's the KC3000 2 terabyte drive, but I think that's a little bit of an overkill, and I don't need 2 terabytes of it. I had a plan that I might pull some of our assets or some of the B-roll that we constantly use into that cache drive, but then it's a little bit small. But if you do want to have a very fast cache drive, I highly recommend the Solidigm P44 Pro 1 terabyte drive, because that would be like the best drive for that. Secondly, performance. How good is the performance gain from 16 cores to 24 cores? And you know, hybrid architecture, Intel versus AMD. Even looking at the, you know, benchmarks and doing the benchmarks beforehand, you realize that, okay, we're probably gonna get about 50-60% gain, sometimes, you know, 100% gain in certain bits. You expect it to be just like blazing fast. But then when we're actually working in our workflow, it does feel faster. Like, don't get me wrong, it really feels faster. But the percentage, you think 50% faster, that's going to be massively faster. It didn't feel as fast as 50% basically. But it definitely is better in Premiere Pro. Next of all, the iGPU and Intel QuickSync, because Ryzen didn't offer that, still doesn't offer that, but we get that with Intel, and that is good. Just so you know, it doesn't give you QuickSync of everything that you're working on, because we've got B-roll, and then we've got some of the 10-bit H.264 422 codecs, which don't have QuickSync codec. This is not enabled, or this is not accelerated on QuickSync, which means that only certain codecs get accelerated. But if you do have H.265, like our B-roll, sometimes the screen recordings, which I'm now always recording in H.265, so I know I get the hardware acceleration on the QuickSync, that works much better. So if I'm speeding up some things, the QuickSync will be like much better. So it does just add extra performance that you weren't able to tap into before. But exports is something that really has gone faster. Exporting footage is much faster with the 4090 and 13900K. Previously, sometimes we had to wait like hours for this, but now really it is many times faster, depending on like what codec, what resolution, but that's like where we've seen really a big increase in speed, how much faster this is. Number 3, I want to talk about one of the biggest surprises I had with this, and I didn't think this was going to be that good, but this is like literally game changing, and this could be like massive for one of you guys as well who are considering this or using similar workflow. So basically, if you're using Adobe products, you can export the video in encoder. So you're going to export the whole project into the media encoder, and then the media encoder will just render the video out. But at the same time, you can use Premiere Pro at the same time. And if you are on a RYZEN system, what happens is that the media encoder will start rendering, and then you can still edit on Premiere Pro, but as soon as you press play on your footage or whatever, it pauses the media encoder and then uses all of those cores and all of the, you know, hardware resources for Premiere Pro, and then you can edit it. Obviously, it starts a little bit slower. There's a little bit of a lag because it has to stop one and then put all the resources to Premiere Pro, but you can edit. Once you have like paused editing or whatever, and you're doing something else, then it plays and starts the media encoder again, and then starts playing this back over there. With the E-core, P-core architecture on Intel, this is absolutely amazing. You export the video, send it to media encoder, press go, and then you go back to media encoder. You can edit video and you don't feel like nothing's happening in the background, and the media encoder is not pausing. And you're thinking, how is this possible? Well, Intel's running some clever magic with the P-cores and E-cores. As soon as you export it to media encoder, the E-cores, the efficiency cores, take over the rendering in the background tasks, and they just manage now the media encoder. And now all of your P-cores are completely free. They're not utilized in anything else, and you can utilize all of those 8 P-cores on video editing, and you can edit video as if nothing's happening in the background. Like, we're exporting sometimes hour-long 4K video in the background and just completely editing. This will take, doesn't matter how long it takes, because you can edit at the same time with no performance drop. I mean, no performance drop. I was just like, surely this is weird. No, literally, it feels like magic. The E-cores are doing their thing. So for creators, those E-cores actually matter a lot. And if you are one of those people who constantly like edits, export at the same time, then this 13th gen, 12th gen E-core, P-core architecture really makes a big difference. Now let's talk about user experience and some of the downsides. As you remember, I said that I'm going to move to Intel because I think it's a more stable platform, and I said we'll have to figure it out because it does appear to be so, but you don't know until you try it, right? So if you're asking me, has your PC crashed since upgrading to it? And I say, yes, it has. I've had a few blue screens of death, but I also figured out why this was happening. And this is what actually is helpful about this video. So once I upgraded my RAM to 128 gigabytes, the XMP stayed the same. So with 2 sticks, it's 5600 megatransfers per second. when you just install another 2 sticks, it doesn't change the XMP. It just knows, okay, there's 4 now, we're gonna keep the same XMP. And it was trying to run the XMP 128 gigabytes, 5600 megatransfers per second. And at first it does it. You can like completely get into the Windows and it's fine. But when you start working with projects and things and start filling the RAM a little bit more, and the RAM capacity has to be spread between perhaps a few of the sticks, not just on 1 stick or 2 sticks, I started to get some crashes and just blue screens of death. Sometimes even in a random place where you're not doing anything, it's just like at there idle, and then zoom, it goes blue and then goes back. And then usually it's like memory management, something, blah, blah, blah. And then I thought, okay, I'm gonna drop it down a little bit. So I dropped it down to 5200 megatransfers per second. So right now we've left it at 5000 megatransfers per second, because when you go, you can enable XMP, but then on the RAM frequency, you can just literally drop it down. When you feel like your RAM isn't stable enough, just drop it down a little bit. And I'm like, okay. And then now at 5000, we literally haven't seen one for like a month or so, which is the like longest periods we have. And that's completely fine. So basically we did get crashes, but I was just actually wanting to know how good is the IMC and can you actually run them all at 5600 megatransfers per second, which at first I thought I could do, but obviously now at 5000 they're working. Now you might be getting a much better results because it's a silicon lottery, depends how good your IMC is, but even mine is better than what Intel advertises, because Intel says that like 4000 is what we promise you can get with 4 sticks of RAM, but mine is 5000 megatransfers per second, so it's a little bit faster. And then the more stable experience comment, the AMD versus Intel, I'd say I think I do have more stable performance on Intel, even though there is a few issues. I still feel like I'm getting much more stable workflow performance in Premiere Pro. So regarding the more stable performance, AMD versus Intel kind of aspect, I do feel like I'm much more stable on that 13th gen Intel plus Nvidia versus Ryzen and Nvidia what I had before. By the way, bear in mind, I've completely clean install. I didn't pull anything previously over there. Everything was like cleanly installed there. And I'm getting much less Premiere Pro crashes here as well. Now, it could be because Premiere Pro has been updating and fixing the bugs and things like that as well, but it's certain things Premiere Pro still crashes. And I think this is due to our workflow, but at the same time, it's Premiere Pro's fault as well, because we are using a lot of multicam edits and then multicams of nested clips, because sometimes we have clips and we multicam and nest them, so that later on when we go inside the nested clips we can change the color grade, but then it changes all of the, like on the top layer, basically everything's down there, but then we can start editing and then later on fix the color grade just all like in one clip. I know you could do it with adjustment layer, but if you got a multicam, you put an adjustment layer on the multicam, what happens is when you change the cameras, you've got a different camera, the color gradings don't match, but there is an adjustment layer in there. So that's why we can't use adjustment layer. Just a little comment on the workflow. But then at the same time, I think our workflow is the one that's bottlenecked and getting some of the crashes there, because we're doing it like that. I know we could make it much more simpler and have like a one video layer, second video layer, and cut them out and have them like laid on top of each other rather than inside, which then it has to play back lots of different things. That's like a little bit of an issue. We have lots of text layers we're working with as well. And so I feel like the workflow, even though the PC is like has the performance, the workflow, how the program works with that workflow, can't utilize exactly the hardware the best way, if that makes sense. There are a few things in Premiere Pro that we realized just crash. For example, like literally today, we realized there's one thing that just crashes in Premiere Pro when we were trying to replace one clip with a proxy, because I had like the same clip but rendered in 2 separate codecs and resolutions. So the playback wasn't as good with the full resolution. So I said, okay, let's attach a proxy of that. But as soon as we said attach a proxy into that folder, it just crashed. We tried it 3 times, every single time, exactly the same place. It crashes. So that's like Premiere Pro's fault or bug. And you know, every time you report it, but it's still a buggy software. But I still have to give Adobe some credit because it crashes less than before. Now, let's talk about power consumption and thermals, because that was one of the things I also mentioned, that I want to use less power. I've been measuring and collecting data on like all of our workflow power consumption. And there's lots of different screenshots of hardware info that's been running for 8 hours, 12 hours, 4 hours, 7 hours, 24 hours, depending like what we're doing or how long the PC is on. And then just measuring like how good is it? Because at first I had the multi-core enhancement on, and since then I have disabled it. So the multi-core enhancement on the BIOS says just let it go as much as you want, and then it can pull like 340 watts or something like that. And some of the early ones, you can see that when it tries to use the multi-core performance rendering and utilizing everything, it just pushes it very, very much to the limit. But often it like spins up this and thermal throttles, because as far as I know, there's no cooler that can cool down 340 watts on just a mainstream CPU there, especially when it's like already working and hot and it's not, I don't know, 18 degrees. Our office constantly is like 25, 26, 27 degrees here. It's a small room. It heats up very quickly with all these things. I've got a fan in there. I'm not sure if you hear it right now. It's very, very hot. So I disabled it and then said just stick to Intel limits, which is 253 watts PL2 limit, which means that it's just gonna run maximum 253 watts in there. If you're asking me, does it still thermal throttle? And I'd say yes, sometimes it does, depending what you're doing. It slightly thermal throttles, but honestly, it's not a problem. I know you might be saying, yeah, but you're leaving performance on the table. But I would argue that even when I'm thermal throttling, I'm still faster than the likes of 7950X that doesn't thermal throttle in my workflow. So I'm still utilizing all of the performance in there. Now, I haven't checked the cooler of this. This is the Arctic Liquid Freezer 420 millimeters. I've got tubes up in there, obviously. It's been already in use like a few years, 2-3 years. I'm not sure if the liquid is maybe going down a little bit or so on. It could be because of that as well. But most of the time, like 95, 96% of the time, it's completely fine, very quiet, doesn't thermal throttle and doesn't boost that high. Now, you're not going to gain a lot more performance with the multi-core enhancement unless you really like need it in multi-core like workflows. I don't see the difference really between 340 and 250 watts. So I'd probably recommend you to just stick to Intel limits and you're going to be completely fine. But then the power consumption, because my previous one was 3950X RYZEN, right? And that pulls maybe 135 watts or something like that maximum. And now we're using pretty much double the performance. But actually, I'm only seeing a small increase in power consumption because of the efficiency cores and how low Intel can idle. It can pull down much easier than the Ryzen ones because Intel has the monolithic CPU design, so all of it is in like on the same package, whereas Ryzen has chiplets, which often uses much more power when idling. So honestly, power consumption not an issue really compared to Ryzen. And bear in mind, 7950X would use much more as well compared to the 3950X, which means that I pretty much have like a double TDP rating on the CPU, but I'm using only a tiny little bit more power on average across the board, which is like good news. What about the 4090 that I have inside there as well? And that is very, very good as well. I've had no problems with that. Sometimes actually, now remembering, there is times where just the screens go and then go back on and I'm like, yeah, what was happening there? I think it's some kind of graphics thing. It's happened maybe a few times, but I don't know why that happens. It could be graphics card, could be something else, I'm not sure. But the 4090 really gets utilized as well. If I'm checking like the wattage, how much we're using it, sometimes it does use like 300, close to 400 watts, so we're using quite a lot of it. But overall, when I don't have the multi-core enhancement on, the PC is quieter and much more efficient than with the multi-core enhancement on. And then lastly, I want to talk about this disappointment really, and it's been with the ProArt. Now, this is not like an obvious thing that you notice on the box, and like I was one of those guys who thought, yeah, of course it's gonna work, yeah, you know, USB-C port, USB-C port, you imagine what you're saying. So in the back of the Z790 Asus ProArt motherboard, there's two Thunderbolt 4 ports, USB-C ports. And you'd be thinking, yeah, if it uses Thunderbolt, you can also use other devices there, right? And the answer is not really. These Thunderbolt ports aren't compatible, or they don't completely support like non-Thunderbolt USB-C devices, meaning like if you got a 10 gigabit USB SSD like this one, or SSD like that one, or this workflow station with SD card readers, it's not gonna work. And it's because it is not supported. It only supports Thunderbolt, not Thunderbolt 4 and like USB-C devices. Now, this is not always the case, and it depends on the controller and some of the hardware in there, because some of the laptops, you have Thunderbolt 4 ports, and then you can use Thunderbolt 4 and USB-C, any devices, it's fine. But on this motherboard, it's just not gonna work. So I'm slightly disappointed because I'm often resorted to use the front panel USB-C port in some of these devices that I need, and I can't use the workflow station like actually on my table because I have to run it through the USB-C port in there, or just USB-C devices that you have. I have more than one and I'd like to use them all the time. They're not working. Now, I did try to buy USB-C to Type A 10 gigabit cable. So it takes USB Type A from the back of the motherboard, because it does have many 10 gigabit ports as well, and then plug it in the back of the workflow station that I'm using. I'm using the Kingston one, but now the secondary one as well, which is the PANS workflow station, I think. And both of them use USB-C 10 gigabits ports. But even when using Type A ports in the back of the motherboard, I just didn't get it to work properly. I should be getting much faster speeds, like some of the cards that should be reading like 250 megabytes per second. I'm getting like 30, 40 megabytes read. So I'm slightly disappointed in that. I wish Asus would fix it, or at least in a motherboard that costs that much, you would have the compatibility for both of those. And then another little disappointment is Explorer crashes. I'm experiencing the Explorer crash, and I don't know if this is because of the motherboard, and if I'm somehow, I know this might sound crazy, but if I'm somehow overloading the capacity of the M.2s and NVMEs and all the data, because I'm constantly like storing a few terabytes, like a good few terabytes of projects on those project types all the time, and I'm seeing the Explorer crash often. I'm like opening this one drive and I'm like, it just all crashes, freezes, and then I'll just have to wait when it just either completely crashes and restarts it, and then comes back alive. And I don't know if this is because of the motherboard, if this is because of the drives. I don't know. If anyone has any tips, I would love to know from you and see if I can works. But they seem quite high-end drives. The speeds are working fine, but just sometimes the Explorer, File Explorer, crashes. And I don't know why. But hey, that's been my experience. Overall, I'd say it's a 9 out of 10 PC, and I still think it's worth it for us because it does make our workflow so much faster, so much easier. And, you know, working around those issues is always a challenge, but actually in the end worth it and helpful for you to know when you're using this. If you have any solutions for me, any tips for me, I would love to hear from you in the comment section below. But if you're a creator, you're wondering, goodness me, I can't afford this, I can't build this, there's good news for you. I have created the best bang for buck build guide in the description below, where you can find the PC build for your budget. Whatever your budget is, I'm explaining everything down there. Upgrades, downgrades, there's many videos in there. I'll explain everything down there. It's completely free. You just check it out and build a PC for your budget. It's all down there. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.